Hello, everyone. Is this working? Yes, you can hear me. Wonderful. So not only am I cutting the last presentation short, but then I'm also the person who's standing in between lunch. So I'm going to try to make this lively and exciting. As Amanda so generously mentioned, I'm a humanist by training, right? So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about what it might mean for us to humanize data. And as some of you might also know, I shared this with some folks yesterday and today. I'm from El Salvador. That's home. It's a little bit far away. And around December, I get a little nostalgic. I don't get to go home too often, but usually I get to go home around this time of the year. And over the time that I've spent here in the US, when I go back home to see my mother and my brother, we've sort of made a ritual and a tradition of panes con chumpe, turkey sandwiches. That's basically what's in season around this time of the year over there. They look something like this. They're delicious. I encourage you to try them out. And I'd like to start off just by mentioning a little bit about this ritual that my family has of making the sauce that you currently see dousing that sandwich on the screen. Now, who in this room likes to cook? Ah, good. Now, who has ever seen a cooking show? Should be everyone in this room. Okay. All right. So the process of making a sauce is perhaps not unfamiliar to you, right? You have a bunch of ingredients, you blend them up, and then you sort of sift through them. And in my family, we've been using this one sieve for as long as I can remember. And actually, I'd like to use that image of the sieve to sort of try to weave a narrative of how we might think about the production of research about ROI in education. Now, I thought I'd do a quick little diagram of the process, the complicated process of making a sauce. Not that complicated, right? But I think it's a convenient analogy to how we might also think about producing knowledge, making research, right? So you have this messy world out there that we sort of try to apprehend in some way, shape, or form, right? Through the way in which we think about the world, what I call our standpoint. And then we sort of make this nice little thing that we like to call data. We've been talking so much about data today, right? And then we sort of take it a little bit further, and then we apply some type of method, and through that we create some type of knowledge. I like to spend some time, or at least the time that I have here today, to think a little bit more about this idea of the standpoint, right? What is the way in which we orient ourselves to the world to try to make sense out of it? Because I think it actually has some implications to the way in which we talk about this notion of ROI, not only for MSIs, but just more broadly as well. So what I'll venture to say is that the current snapshot, right, the prevailing wind of how we think about ROI and how we frame it for our prospective students and ourselves as researchers is through something like this, right? Someone mentioned just in this previous talk, right, the college scorecard. This is a snapshot of the college scorecard, right? Might not be legible, right? But for example, in this little section here, right, you have this, check out these schools, 25 four-year schools with low costs that lead to high incomes. This might be the first point of entry for some of our prospective students to start thinking about what may matter in education, right? So what I would say is that it seems that there's quite a bit of power in numbers when we think about education, right? When we think about why it is that we might want to become educated. Or, and this is what I'm going to try to invite us to think about, is that we like to give a lot of power to numbers. Not only in terms of how we talk about it with our students, but also how we talk about it amongst ourselves, right? What other folks have called the quantification of educational research. Now, I'm not new in making this claim, and I'm actually not here to try to offer a critique of quantitative approaches to educational research. Now, this is a quote from Walter Allen, right? But I do want to call attention to perhaps what might be some of the opportunities that we foreclose when we think about it in this particular point of view. This is my proposition, right? I think that the quantified way in which we talk about ROI entrenches educational researchers' empathy gap. What do I mean by that? So what I'm actually talking about here is not perhaps how others perceive MSIs or how we might be conducting the research, but actually how we're talking about MSIs and research with one another. Perhaps you've come across this idea of the empathy gap through sort of literature in psychology about implicit bias, but I'd actually like to extend that image to also talk about how we think about the research that we think is valuable and how researchers who are in quantitative fields might perhaps not be properly thinking about the historicity of some of the data sets that they're using. So Tukufu's Berry at Penn has sort of written a little bit about that, and I'll let you sort of go through this one little quote that I think is particularly useful, and then I'll try to illustrate what I mean with an example from the census. So we spent quite a bit of time thinking a little bit about data quality, and also a little bit about what counts as data, right? But also how we make data count. And what I think is important for us to take into account is that there's a risk in perhaps not necessarily historicizing how we think about data. And I think that this little example illustrates that for us, right? These are the census race categories all the way from 1790 through the present, right? When we think about data, we also have to think about the embedded politics and racial ideologies in the data sets that we have amassed. Right? And there's a willful desire to think about the transparency of that data when we're producing these analyses. And I think this goes back to one of Neil's points earlier on, right? Also one of the points earlier as well about the idea of data disaggregation as just becoming visible. Right? And the instruments that we use are politicized in that they make us become visible. Now, I'm not trying to make a wholesale dismissal of quantitative approaches to ROI, right? Or as I recently learned, this one little idiom in English, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Such a peculiar image. That's not what I'm in for here. It's actually an invitation to think about the production of knowledge and the production of research differently, with what I like to call it sort of compassionate research praxis, right? An opportunity for us to be producing quantitative research alongside those of us who might be humanists or who might be willing to properly historicize some of these data sets that we're using for our research. I started off with this image of sifting the blended mess that becomes into this delicious sauce. A couple of years ago, that one little cloth that we've been using in my family for as long as I can remember actually ripped. We didn't stop using it. We ended up using a cheesecloth alongside that same seed. What I'd like to think about is how do we as educational researchers are using different sieves alongside one another? In what ways can we actually come together to think not only about ROI and the ways we've been discussing here, but also alongside other interlocutors who might help us think about this in historicized ways as well. Thank you.